My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the publisher of the Texas National Security Review. In this new episode of Horns of a Dilemma, we have Will Inboden, the director of the Clements Center and Editor-in-Chief of TNSR, moderating a fascinating discussion at the Texas Tribune Festival called The Threat Assessment. The panelists include the Intelligence Studies Project Senior Advisor John Brennan and former CIA Director, Admiral Will McRaven, former SOCOM Commander and, of course, former Chancellor of the University of Texas System, National Counterterrorism Center Director Nick Rasmussen, and NBC's Chief Correspondent Richard Engel. Enjoy the show.
So to address this topic today on the threat assessment, the national security threats facing our country with a special focus on terrorism, but also some of the others, we couldn't assemble a better group than these four gentlemen with me right here. You've got the details of the very impressive bios in your books. If I read all those, we'd be here for the whole hour, but these are four really distinguished Americans. Very briefly, we've got Admiral Bill McRaven on the far end there, former whose military career culminated in being the commander of Special Operations Command. Next to him, we've got John Brennan, whose very distinguished career culminated. Most recently as director of the CIA. Next to him, we've got Richard Engel, the Chief Foreign Correspondent for NBC News. And I should say, a man who has spent the better part of the last two decades in the broader Middle East, South Asia, and some really difficult places. So certainly reporting from the very front lines, also a distinguished author of a couple books. And then finally, right next to me, we've got Nick Rasmussen. So I was honored to work with Nick on the National Security Council staff many years ago back in the day, and he recently stepped down as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, again, overseeing all of our government's counterterrorism activities and initiatives. So, all right, we're going to dispense with opening statements, and the guys said they just want to dive into the discussion. So, first question up. A couple of weeks ago, we passed the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. All of you, your careers were shaped indelibly by, of course, that day and then everything that has happened since. What would you say have been our country's biggest successes in the 17 years since, particularly in the fight against terrorism? And then perhaps our failures or our deficiencies as you look back over those past 17 years. Admiral, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Will. First, great to be here at the Trib Fest, and thanks for hosting this, and Will, thanks for being the moderator. You know, as I look back, I think, frankly, the biggest accomplishment is pulling the interagency together. So for the broader audience, prior to 9/11, you obviously had the great work being done by CIA and FBI and the military and DEA and all of the various law enforcement and intelligence agencies, but it wasn't very well connected. 9/11 happens. You know, you get the report from the 9/11 Commission, but frankly, the nation understood that we had to pull together as a nation in order to kind of fight this war. It took us a few years. As Nick and I were on the National Security Council staff in 2001, and we were struggling to pull the interagency together. 2 years later, when I got into combat in Iraq, we were still struggling a little bit, and then probably within 3 or 4 years, all of a sudden, everything kind of started to hit on all cylinders. And you saw the magnificent work of the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, the military community come together in a way that I'm not sure we will ever see again, because we had a mission, which was protecting the nation and doing the nation's work. And everybody passed intelligence, passed law enforcement information in a way that was really impressive, and I think would make the American people proud. My concern, of course, is it's good that we have kind of settled down in Iraq and Afghanistan, but what you're starting to see now is those relationships are beginning to atrophy a little bit, and we're going to have to work very hard to kind of keep that interagency process strong, focused, and build not only the professional relationships, but the personal relationships that certainly Nick, John, and I have developed over the last several decades.
First of all, it's great to be back in Austin, Longhorn country. Thanks for the interrogation lights. Makes me feel at home. Can't see anything here. Just to pick up on what Bill said, that integration across the federal government, I think, has been so critically important to the successes we've had over the last 17 years. But there's also been vertical integration as well. The connectivity between the federal government and state and locals, and a lot of things that the National Counterterrorism Center and others have done to be able to make sure you move intelligence very quickly from the point of collection to where you really need to act upon it. So that, I think, has been a real positive. I don't think we have done as good a job as we need to in terms of going upstream. We do a lot of fighting of terrorists, but we really have not addressed those factors and conditions, the environmental circumstances that really contribute to the individuals who decide for one reason or another to jump on a terrorist bandwagon, to strap on a suicide vest. And I do think that the United States government really has a responsibility, global responsibility, as well as, I think, a moral obligation to be able to address this and not just fight the terrorists that happen to make it downstream.
Richard.
So, 17 years. They've been quite a, it's a big piece of our lives. If I just look out in the audience right here, there are a lot of people in their 40s and 50s, so 17 years has been probably the most important and transformative period of their adulthood. And people who are students, this was their childhood. And look what happened in this period. It started out with 24 attackers with box cutters who brought down some airplanes and killed several thousand Americans. And then we talk about having launched 2 wars in response, Iraq and Afghanistan, but really we launched 3. There was Iraq and Afghanistan, which were more conventional, and then there was the hidden war, the covert war of manhunting that the people on this stage were deeply involved in. And the Afghanistan war is still going on, the manhunting war is still going on, Iraq is more or less over, though the country is still in a difficult situation. And what did we accomplish in this? I think we accomplished decimating Al-Qaeda, but I think we created a lot of enemies at the same time. And we changed as well as a nation. We engaged in this global war on terrorism that set the mindset. It changed how we think about security at home. It changed how we think about foreign countries. It was really a transformative event. And maybe now we're emerging from it. It feels like for the first time we are entering a new phase, the post-global war on terrorism era, where we're starting to focus on China, on Russia, on other periods. So when I think about what we accomplished, I think it was a transformative period of history, and maybe we're now seeing that closing bracket. I always wondered when we would see it. If 9/11 started this era, maybe right now we're closing this era and we're moving to another phase.
All right, Nick.
On the accomplishments side of the ledger, I think picking up on some of what Bill and John and Richard have said, there's no doubt that we've created a much more effective architecture for protecting Americans and keeping them safe from terrorism attack. That Homeland Security architecture, you could argue whether we spent too much money and or maybe didn't do so in the most efficient way, but there's no question that we are a harder target for the terrorist operating overseas if they're thinking about the homeland, and that's a major accomplishment. The effort it took on Al-Qaeda to mount a 9/11 attack, it would be quite a formidable proposition for a group operating overseas to carry out that kind of attack now. And again, I'm not here to argue that every dollar, every decision, every investment was necessarily the wisest or the most efficient. On the part of the job that is left undone, again, I would align myself with what John Brennan was saying. It's clear that we have the tactical part of the terrorism fight down to a science. We are very, very good at this. Colleagues in the military, colleagues in the intelligence community can go after those terrorist adversaries who are the most dangerous, who we have intelligence on that tells us are engaged in activities directly aimed at U.S. interests. But have we done enough to change conditions, to address factors that lead to radicalization, that cause young men, young women to strap suicide bombs on themselves? The answer is clearly no, because we seem to be a bit on a treadmill in this regard. I don't want to blame us entirely for that, because I think it's with some humility that I approach that task of trying to change conditions in far-flung societies around the world. But if we don't make that effort, as John said, if we don't accept some of that responsibility, we will be dealing with some form of this problem in perpetuity.
So I want to follow up on a point that a number of you made in some different ways. Richard, you put it most acutely, saying that we may be at the end of this 17-year global war in the shadows, and we may be bracketing it. And last year, the Trump administration released its national security strategy, which identifies China and Russia as the top order threats facing the country right now, and doesn't say terrorism isn't a threat anymore, but puts it to a second tier, if you will. So I guess my question for each of you: how serious is the jihadist threat to the United States today? Is it still out there at all? Of what magnitude? Are we taking it seriously enough? Or does it deserve to be put in that, still serious but second tier behind the great power threat? So, Admiral, why don't we start with you on this?
Well, let me go back to, is the global war on terrorism over or in decline? I mean, I would hope it is, but I'm not sure it is. In the special operations community in 2017, we lost 42 soldiers that left behind 93 children. So there is this belief that, we're not out there really fighting anymore, somebody else is doing the fighting for us. Absolutely not the case. I mean, the guys are still on the ground in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and lives are still being lost. It just doesn't get the play that it used to at the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan war. I think, my concern always with terrorism is, we've got to get it right 100% of the time. They only have to get it right once. And so when you take a look at Russia and China, it's not that I would disagree that they are clearly threats, certainly Russia, China more on the economic side, but you will see the indicators. It is a big machine. In order for the Russians to mobilize, in order to invade another country, we will begin to see the indicators in a way that I think will allow us to address those earlier rather than later. The problem, of course, with terrorism, whether it's homegrown terrorism or international terrorism, we may not have those indicators until something blows up. And now all of a sudden, if it's on an airliner, it changes the dynamics overnight. So we can never rest. This is, frankly, a fight I think we will fight in perpetuity. That it is just something we as the American people have got to accept. This is the price of doing business as an American, is that there will always be a threat of terrorism. There has always been a threat of terrorism. It hasn't quite been this large. But I think now, as we look across the globe, we have to be careful about assuming that we're not going to have another attack soon, because I think that possibility is always out there, and it's just fundamentally different than Russia and China.
Yeah. Following up on that about the 42 combat deaths, I'm not aware of any combat deaths we've had in last year of conflict with Russia or China by Americans. So yeah, that again, by that metric, it's still very acute. John?
The challenges on the national security front is what's the appropriate balance that you strike, particularly for a country like the United States that has basically unrivaled global responsibilities. So whether you talk about terrorism, you're talking about Russia, non-proliferation, whatever else. And I do think that there needs to be that balancing. Understandably, after 9/11, the United States put all of its tremendous resources against the terrorist threat because we didn't want to see another 3,000 innocents killed. We didn't want to see another World Trade Center bombed and attacked. But like Bill, I feel as though we've damaged Al-Qaeda quite a bit, and certainly the same with ISIS. But every time I go through an airport, I always say thank you to the TSA officers who are doing their jobs. Because Al-Qaeda, ISIS, others, they have a fixation with aircraft. And they have some diabolical and ingenious ways to miniaturize, to make non-metallic, to conceal different types of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, to take down an airliner, and they want to do it over the United States as well. And we've stopped them a number of times over the years. But as Bill mentioned, if there is an airliner with 200, 250 passengers that comes down, you're going to have, once again, this great pendulum swing on the counterterrorism front. So I think you want to prevent that, or at least minimize the greatest extent possible their ability to succeed. But at the same time, you cannot ignore some of the other world challenges that we face.
Yeah. Richard, real quick, a word from me to the audience, by the way. So next time any of us are, as I often do, griping in the TSA line at the airport about this and that, remember what John said, right? Those folks, I'm sure those folks are doing their jobs. So, all right, Richard. Okay.
I worry about terrorism, particularly now, because terrorists, I think, are always looking to have an impact that is larger than the act itself. So if you want to have a terrorist attack, they don't want it to be a tree that falls in the forest and nobody hears. And right now, because of the divisions in our society that I think are painfully obvious, because of the strains and divisions regarding Americans' opinion about our political leadership. I could imagine very easily that terrorists would see this would be a particularly good time to carry out an attack and get an outsized influence for a minor, mid-size, or even, God forbid, a large-scale attack. So while the organizations, Al-Qaeda and others, have been certainly set back, some organizations have been created by our efforts and then set back again. I worry that right now, because of all that's going on in our politics, we might be more susceptible to a shock to the system than we would be at other times.
Yeah. Certainly seems to be Vladimir Putin's intention. So, yeah. Nick,
So-
terrorist threat.
Once a year, while I was still in government service and while John was in government service, we would have the opportunity in February of each year to go in front of the Congress and give testimony in a public setting on all threats, in a sense. What are the range of things that threaten U.S. interests around the world? And if you trace the arc of the remarks that leaders of the intelligence community were making, several years ago, the discussion would have been almost exclusively on terrorism around the world. Over time, that has broadened out to a conversation that includes cyber threats, state actor threats from Russia, China, North Korea, et cetera. And I'd be, as the terrorism guy, I would be the last person to argue that that was inappropriate, because we do face significant threats across these other dimensions. And yet, at the same time, as my colleagues have pointed out, the outsized impact, the asymmetric impact that a terrorist attack would have on our politics, on our economy, on our society, in the way that it did at the time of 9/11, all of that requires that we continue to remain vigilant, that we continue to invest in this capability to both play offense and defense. And that's expensive, and it's time-consuming, and it demands resources. And as I was leaving government last December, that was the piece that kind of gnawed at me the most, was that I saw the resource piece of this looming as something that was going to be a challenge for my successor. My successor was going to have to argue for his or her share of the national security pie in a way that I often didn't, because it was assumed that we would always fully resource counterterrorism efforts. But now the cyber folks, Lord knows we need the cyber folks to be well-equipped, well-armed, to do what we need them to do. The counterintelligence community that is monitoring bad actions by the Russians or the Iranians or others in our political system. So it's more complicated than just saying, yeah, we need to keep spending money on counterterrorism.
Thanks. By the way, we're not getting audience questions just yet, but let me read out the text and Twitter instructions again. I didn't see they're not up there yet, just so you can be ready. So if you want to text a question, text it to Ask Trib, one word, or the number is our area code 512-692-0689, and then on Twitter it's hashtag AskTrib. All right, I want to turn now, broadening the scope just a little bit, to a region that has been very consuming for all of you for really the better part of the last 2 decades, including several of you have lived there a good part of your adult lives, and that's the broader Middle East and South Asia. I know, John, this has been an interest of yours going back to your undergraduate years and even your graduate years here at UT, as well as professionally. So while jihadist terrorism is a global concern, as we've been talking about, its ideological and geographic epicenter is still that region, which has, of course, experienced considerable turmoil and shock over the last 15 years, the Iraq War, the Arab Spring, and so on and so forth. So what do you think will be the main determinants of the future of the broader Middle East and South Asia? What should America's priorities be in the region? And is there much hope in the near and medium term for more stability, more peace, a better pathway in that region? So we've been going this way. How about Nick? We'll start. Yeah, start.
Wow.
Good call.
Future of the Middle East.
Yeah,
That's right,
fix
yeah,
the Middle East.
Yeah, that's right.
I guess broadly
And while you're at it, South Asia too. Okay.
Broadly speaking, I think it's obvious that it's in the interest of the United States that we see economic and political liberalization in that part of the world. Because, again, if you fundamentally believe that more open, more liberal, more inclusive societies and forms of governance lead to populations feeling more invested and less inclined to be drawn into the suicide bomber camp, then that should be what we are aiming for. That said, that kind of transformative political change across the entire Middle East and South Asia region is clearly episodic and spotty at best, and certainly not anything that will be accomplished within a single generation. So it's a formidable task. But if that agenda can be pursued, and if we can support leaders and thinkers in those societies that are pursuing that agenda, then that should over time decrease the pool of potential extremists. But that's an argument for playing really effective offense and defense while that process is playing out, because that process does not take place just because we have a new leader in Saudi Arabia or a new leader in Egypt or Morocco or pick your Middle Eastern country.
So if you think of the Middle East, when I first moved out to the Middle East in 1996, the Middle East was established. Everyone understood the rules of the game. All the countries were run by strongmen, family dictatorships, most of them aligned with the United States or even moderately pro-American. They were deeply corrupt. They were run by these family dictatorships, these big men. They were run by the military that they lavished spending upon. And that status quo existed for several decades. It wasn't a great status quo. These regimes were rotten on the inside, but they were stable. If you'll permit me to use an analogy, and all analogies are imperfect, but I used to think of them as little houses, row houses, one next to each other. And they looked okay, and they looked stable enough, but they were really quite rotten, like a house on the beach that nobody takes much care of, one next to the other. You could put your finger through the wall, and they looked okay, but you could knock down the door if you tried. And that's what we did after 9/11. We slammed into Iraq, and what happened was a lot of the rot, a lot of the problems that were pent up inside this regime, the Sunni Shia problem, the Arab-Kurd problem, the Iran-Iraq problem, the Turkish-Kurd problem, a lot of these much older problems that had been pent up and kept in place by this framework of dictatorships were unleashed and started to spread from one place to the other, from one house to the next. And I think that reached its peak with ISIS. Now we're starting to see a shift back in the other direction with a new generation of strongmen re-emerging to try and take those problems and pull them back inside. And I think we're seeing that in Egypt. There's attempts to do that in Libya. Certainly you're seeing Assad trying to and succeeding to a large degree to reassert his brutal dominance over his country. So while since 9/11 we've gone through a serious episodic shift from 24 people who attack with box cutters to 24 special operations forces led by this man who ultimately killed Osama bin Laden through the efforts of many others. I think we've seen an episodic shift in the Middle East from corrupt strongman dictatorship to a period of chaos to now the strongmen reemerging.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. John?
I think during the Arab Spring, there was a fair amount of naivete in Washington from the standpoint of, if you just remove these authoritarian leaders, democracy is going to flourish. And democracy is not a light switch. It's obviously a journey. We're 242 years into it ourselves, and we still don't have it right. But what happened in the Middle East was a real jolt to the system, and as Richard said, it unleashed a lot of those pent-up tensions and aspirations, and not all of it were rooted in democratic foundational principles. And to me, and I agree with Nick, it really takes enlightened leadership to try to navigate this democratic journey, and for individuals to be able to try to move their countries just a little bit, because it's going to take time. And it's not just the Middle East and South Asia that require enlightened leadership. It is more countries around the world, and I won't name any specific. But from the standpoint of trying to deal with the challenges of the 21st century, it really is tough, and there's too much, I think, parochial interests that are at play. Too much corruption is there, And so as long as that happens, and we have different manifestations of populism around the world, in many respects, the Al-Qaedas and the ISISes and others were sort of the harbingers of some of the populist movements around. There was such disenchantment with the existing governments and politicians that individuals gravitated toward other philosophies, other ideologies, and trying to take matters into their own hands as a way to rebel. So like Bill, I think it's the situation out there is still going to feed a lot of this, the violence, whether it is domestic insurrection or it's going to be groups that are going to engage in the different types of terrorist activities. But I do think we need to be able to make some incremental progress and not have these strongmen just try to protect themselves and try to perpetuate their own governance.
Yeah, and I would agree with all the panelists, but we have to stay engaged. I think that would be my cautionary note. Even with the strong men, you have to have a relationship, you have to stay engaged. But if I had to put my money someplace right now, it would be in the State Department and begin to build up the diplomatic corps, the Foreign Service Officer Corps again, so that we have those great civil servants that are out and about, that understand what's going on the ground, that can provide the great insights to the ambassadors, to the leaders back here in the States, so we understand, are we moving the needle? And what you see from great ambassadors is they are prepared to engage with the heads of states in a way that is going to move the needle, but also maintains the integrity of the United States, that we stand for human rights, and we stand for civilian control of the military, and we stand for these important ideals. But if there is no engagement and no dialogue and no core of professionals that can do that, then you never move the needle. The needle kind of stays right where it is, and you just have a relationship. We can't just have a relationship. We have to begin to move the needle so that we can get back to what Nick was talking about, which is how do you fundamentally change the situation on the ground? You change the situation on the ground when the governments are prepared to make their government more liberal, more engaging. That doesn't happen unless we have the right people in the right place. I would also offer that when we look at foreign aid, again, Nick said it earlier, every dollar we have spent has not been spent wisely, no question about it. But that doesn't mean we should stop providing foreign aid to those countries that I think need it, because frankly, that foreign aid is about us. Anybody that thinks it's altruistic, that we're trying to take care of the people in a particular country, yes, there is some altruism, but more of it is the more stable we can make that country, the less violent they are, the better it is for us. So I think our future is about more engagement, not less engagement.
I will say, by the way, that some of the most eloquent and impassioned voices on behalf of funding the State Department actually come from our military leaders, like Admiral McRaven. Many of you, Jim Mattis put it most poignantly recently. He said, "If you don't fully fund the State Department, I need to buy more bullets." All right, so following up on a number of the issues we were talking about there across the broader Middle East and South Africa, one of the byproducts of the chaos, the violence, the instability, the civil war, and displacement has been these massive refugee flows from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe, and then some over here into the United States. And that, of course, has in turn prompted some very impassioned debates in Europe and the United States about refugees and immigration policy. From your vantage point as national security professionals, what kinds of principles should Europe and the United States follow? I'm not talking about the nuts and bolts of immigration, but I'm talking about the principles. What kind should we follow on refugee policy that balance compassion, humanitarianism, and diversity with the national security imperatives and national unity as well? Nick, what?
Well, this was, again, as I was leaving government, this was one of the most complex and challenging issues at the top of the agenda. And obviously transitioning as I did from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, there was a different approach on immigration, you might have noticed. But I'll tell you what I think we were trying to do inside the national security community was to have a fact-based, analytically driven discussion about where threat resides, where are we actually at risk, and from whom, and also to, at the same time, improve our capacity to do the very necessary nuts and bolts work of screening and vetting people who would enter into the country, because that needs to happen regardless of what immigration parameters you set for us as a society. And I think we can take a lot of pride that we are very, very, very much further along in our ability to know something about someone before they come into the United States, certainly than we were a decade ago. But that will always be an imperfect science. We will never have all of the information at our disposal that allows us to know everything about someone. And yet, if you look at the numbers over the last decade, the terrorism-related incidents inside the United States, by and large, cannot be laid at the hands of refugees or recent immigrants. In the main, these events in the United States typically involve someone who has been here for many, many years, who radicalized, who developed their worldview here, and who moved along that path to violence while they were here, in our communities here inside the United States. So homegrown terrorism here is not an immigration problem, it's another kind of problem. I want to differentiate ourselves a little bit from Europe in this regard, because Europe found itself dealing with unprecedentedly large population flows that overwhelmed their systems and their ability to know who was coming into their country and what that person might have in mind. And so I find myself in great sympathy for some of our European colleagues who are trying to manage that flow. And so I would not say that our problem and their problem were the same. But here in the United States, I feel pretty well grounded in saying that we are not at risk from a terrorism perspective, from a more diverse society driven by a welcoming immigration policy. We just simply aren't from a terrorism perspective.
Sure. So we are, of course, a nation of immigrants. Immigration makes us stronger. It makes us better. It makes us think more. It makes our society grow. It makes our society function. But uncontrolled immigration is a frightening and disruptive thing. And it's what we saw in Europe when the Arab Spring happened and ISIS was rampaging through the Middle East. We saw a massive immigration flow, uncontrolled, from Mediterranean and North Africa and other parts of the Middle East up into Europe. And I think that's why we saw so much of the rise of the right wing in Europe, why we saw so many disruptions that are still playing out with political disruptions in Eastern Europe, with Brexit that's happening, with movements that are rising more to the forefront in Italy and other countries. So I think that's what happened there. The same reason uncontrolled immigration is frightening to many people in this country, where you have wars and disruptions in Central and other parts of Latin America, and they're driving a lot of people up in Venezuela, and they're driving people up to this country. So while immigration is necessary, it is what makes us function as a society, what makes us a better society. There are issues, real issues, about the fear of uncontrolled immigration. So I think you have to strike that balance. We generally haven't been able to strike that balance, and we've seen in many countries populist leaders using that flow, using the fear of that flow, using the fear of uncontrolled immigration to achieve sometimes very narrow political interests.
Yeah.
As you said in your question, how do you balance our humanitarianism, our compassion, our American values with national security? And that is the issue, as was pointed out. How do you balance them? Because you want to be able to optimize both, but there is demagoguing that tries to point to people who look different than us, who speak different than us, who have different backgrounds. And that just, I think, preys upon the fears and concerns of people. In the 21st century, the historic arc of globalization and globalism is inevitable, despite what people say in terms of whether you're building walls or isolation. The movement of people and goods and ideas and technologies across borders is what makes this great world so great, and will continue to. But what do you do in order to ensure that you can, again, balance and manage that tremendous interaction and interconnectedness of the world, so you optimize security at the same time of all these things that do make this country very special? As the son of an immigrant, I feel very strongly that we don't want to not be this world's melting pot. And we want our educational institutions, we want our businesses and others to be able to tap into the tremendous skills and capabilities and talents of people around the world, and not to close ourselves off. If we close ourselves off, the terrorists and others are the ones who are winning. We need to be able to continue to go along this great path of the American experience and journey, while at the same time trying to keep our people, our citizens, safe. And that's the challenge for the people who are in positions of authority, to get that balance right.
Amen.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing I'd offer, Will, and I agree with everything that's been said. I think it was maybe 2005. At one point in time in Iraq, we were concerned about what we referred to as bleed out. So those that were coming from outside Iraq, coming to fight for Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time, and after the fighting, how many of them went back and created problems in their home countries? And interestingly enough, as we looked at it, the bleed out wasn't bad at all. And I think it shocked us, because we thought, there are probably hundreds of people that are coming, and then after they really get punched in the face, they go, ooh, this was a really bad idea. I'm heading home. Yeah. Well, when they headed home, they went to ground, because they didn't want to be associated with Al-Qaeda anymore, because they knew the local police would come get them. So the concerns about radicalization inside Iraq at the time, I won't say they were unfounded. They were just not to the degree we thought. Now, Nick raised a great point, which is the problem is, of course, as Syria has unfolded and this mass migration has occurred, the Europeans just haven't had the capability to be able to identify in a proper way those threats that are coming to their shores. We are kind of fundamentally different in that regard. But I couldn't agree more with what John just said in terms and what everybody has said. I mean, we are a nation of immigrants, and for us not to bring in great folks from all around the world, it will change who we are as a country in a bad way if we don't figure out what the right balance is.
All right, I'm going to put one more question to the panel in a moment, but before I do, please do have your questions ready and coming in. Again, you want to text them to AskTrib or hashtag tweet them to AskTrib. I hope I'm getting that right. I'm actually not on Twitter, but anyway, I'm told it exists. So
Twitter does exist.
Yeah, that's right. So last question for the panel is about a very specific country, a threat to the United States, but a country that in some ways touches on a lot of the issues we've been talking about here, the divisiveness here at home, the destabilization in the Middle East, and so on. This is Russia. So as we look at the destabilization in the Middle East, a lot of it is a product of some of the internal dynamics in the region. But, without a doubt, the fact that Putin has reasserted Russia as a very dominant, influential outside power in the region, ways they haven't been since the early 70s, especially with their client state in the Assad regime in Syria, but their activities throughout the region. But we also know that Russia's interests are not confined to the Middle East. They're trying to do a lot to destabilize and undermine European unity, weaken NATO. And even though I'm not on Twitter, I'm told Russia's been doing a lot of mischief here in the United States, too, on our social media. So for each of you, how should the United States be thinking about the Russia threat? I mean, is this really a new global challenge, different in kind, but still of the same nature as the Cold War, where this is an adversary that is manifesting itself in every region of the world and trying to undermine us at home? Or is this more a story of an ornery dictator, Putin, presiding over a declining, weakening power that we're inflating to be much more than it actually is? We just need to wait this out. So, Nick?
Well, it's certainly, the concerns we have about Russia certainly aren't the same as the concerns we had during the Cold War period, when it was clearly a concern about a force-on-force military conflict on the European continent, and you could literally line up your order of battle on each side, figure out who would prevail at what level of cost. And war was very scary when you thought about it in that way. What I think we see now is much more a Russia that is, in relative terms, nowhere near the United States in terms of power and influence, but has shown a proclivity for using what they do have in asymmetric ways. And the nefarious, malevolent, whatever adjective you want to assign to it, activity to involve themselves in our political system as a tool to advance their national security, that's a threat. That's a kind of threat we did not face during the Cold War, and it's obviously a challenge to us, but it's one that we haven't, I don't think, yet developed the toolkit that we need to fight back. because that has always been the challenge of asymmetric warfare. How do you recreate symmetry? How do you, when is it worth it to escalate? When do you simply have to take it? And these are challenges that you want to step through as a government and count on your national security architecture to wrestle with those. I think there's concern right now that we don't have unanimity across the board of our senior national security figures that this Russia threat is of the sort that I described. And if you can't get agreement around that, then it's very hard to get agreement around what we do about it.
So I think if you want to understand Russia very briefly, think of these numbers: 400, 70, 10, 20. 470, 10, 20. So 400 years, Russia was a czarist society, from Ivan the Terrible to Nicholas II. 400 years of effectively a monarchy. Then you had 70 years of a totalitarian communist system, from Lenin to Gorbachev. And then it all fell apart. From 1989 to 91, first the outer empire collapsed, and then the home state itself collapsed. A traumatic experience. Putin has called it the worst experience of the modern era. So 470, then it all comes crashing down. By the way, it came crashing down largely from Russia's perspective because of our actions and because of the UK's actions. They blame us for this. Then you had 10, so 470 collapse, 10 years of, under Boris Yeltsin, of flirtation with democracy, gangsterism, and then what's happened for the last 20 years, almost 20 years. They've had the intelligence services coming back. And you started your opening statement saying, what have we been doing for the last 17 years? For the last 17 years, we've been involved in the global war on terrorism. For the last nearly 20 years, Russia has been run once again by its intelligence services. And what do you think they've been thinking about?
John, what have they been thinking?
Yeah. I agree with Richard, certainly. Putin, I think, sees the world in zero sum and has felt that Russia has been quite aggrieved and disrespected over the years. And so he believes that Russia needs to reclaim its rightful place on that world stage. I think he is a clever tactician, and he has taken advantage of opportunities over the course of the last 20 years to seize ground, both literally and figuratively, using intelligence services very insidiously and effectively, and trying to, and just the audacity of going into Ukraine, annexing Crimea, poisoning people on British soil, involved in our election. He has been, I think, pretty masterful in terms of pushing and going into Syria in a big way, pushing the outer edge of the envelope without provoking some type of response other than sanctions. And I think, as Nick mentioned, I don't think we have the tools yet, at least refined, to be able to make sure that we're able to push back against Mr. Putin. He's persistent, but when you look at the economy, one-resource economy, aging demographics, he knows that if you look at the Russian prospectus, it's not a very good one. It's not like China with a much longer-term, healthy outlook. So he needs to sort of seize the moment. That's what he's doing.
In 2006, I had command of the U.S. Special Operations Command in Europe. And we had 19 nations that were part of our European Special Operations Force. And I remember one of my first trips to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, sitting down kind of with the leadership there. They were concerned about Russian invasion. And I'm thinking, really? You've been watching way too many spy movies or something, you know? And frankly, I was pretty dismissive of the whole thing. I just thought it was this kind of paranoia, small countries, former Soviet Union, this, and then Crimea happens. And then you see the intervention in the Ukraine. So my concern with Russia is, where do we draw the line? At what point in time do we take a stand? Certainly, in my opinion, we should have taken a stand on the cyber, but it is complicated, as others have said. But there's going to be a point in time when we will have to take a stand, and that means relying back again on our allies. So if we continue to dismiss the European allies in a way that does not put us in a position of strength when the Russians do something, it's going to be very, very difficult for us. So we are going to have to, from a national standpoint, define what that line looks like for the Russians. Because if they make another intervention, what will we do? And we can't wait until that happens to make that decision. We have to think through it now. So I have some grave concerns about our, again, our long-term thought process vis-a-vis Russia.
Right. All right, so we're going to turn now to the audience questions. So Darla, what do you have for us?
Thank you. Hello. The first question from the audience is from Matt Green, and he asks, tell us how concerned we should be about cyber threats to our energy grid and infrastructure, and have we taken the right protective steps?
Nick, you want to take that one first? Okay. All right. Okay.
You know, one of the things we're paid to do in the intelligence world is think through worst-case scenarios and look at our adversaries, assess their capabilities, and determine what are the range of likely outcomes, and what is also the cost of particular threats that we may face. And certainly, attacks on our infrastructure, whether they're from a cyber perspective or, as we thought about more in the post-9/11 period immediately, from terrorists, is something that we have come a long way in terms of of hardening our architecture, what I described before. And yet, there's a cat and mouse aspect to this too. Everything we do to get better in hardening that architecture, hardening our defenses, is something that can be defeated by someone, slightly more clever or slightly more adept operating against us. So it is literally a constant game of trying to stay ahead of that next threat. I think we still think of those threats largely in terms of state actor terms, what an Iran could do, what a Russia could do, what a China could do. But increasingly, we now need to think about those threats in terms of non-state actors as well, because if it's happening through an individual sitting at a keyboard somewhere, that individual could just as easily be a non-state actor, a terrorist, a criminal, as a representative of a Russian intelligence service. So the range of people to be worried about in this regard is wider than ever. But it's also an area where I think the U.S. is pursuing a lot of innovative defensive solutions as well.
You others on this one?
I think I don't know specifically, and I'd love to hear your opinions, how robust our nuclear energy reactors are to a cyber attack, and I don't have that kind of information. And I'm sure they do, but they might not want to be sharing it on this forum. But I think what's important is to understand that cyber attacks aren't just about disrupting computers. You mentioned Estonia a moment ago. I was recently in Estonia. They had a cyber attack, and it didn't just shut down their banking system, although it did. It didn't just shut down their telephone grid, although it did that too. They were also, at the same time, people sent from Russia to create problems in the streets. They were people setting off car bombs and explosives and agents provocateurs. So you had a disruptive attack that was bothering your banking system, your cell phones. And then there was also a degree of chaos in the streets. So when you think of this hybrid attack that happened against a very small country right on Russia's border, it was very disruptive. So was that a cyber attack, or was that a genuine, regular attack that had a cyber component? And I think going forward, we're going to see more and more of the two coming together, where power grids, where cell phones, where banks, and where there are real-world consequences. So not only does your phone not work, but you open the window and you look outside, and something frightening is going on in the streets. And that combination, I think, is very significant and is going to be increasingly apparent in the future of warfare.
The digital ecosystem, which the electric grid is within, holds our future security and prosperity in its midst. And it is an ever-evolving environment with new technologies as well as new malwares and new techniques and tactics. And I really do believe that we need to be thinking more about how we're going to make that environment it's not going to be impenetrable, because there's always going to be ways to be able to get into systems, whatever else. You have to make it as the least vulnerable as possible, but also as resilient as possible. And so whether or not you're talking about nation-state actors and non-nation-state actors who are just going to navigate into systems and try to bring them down, the real challenge for our society is what is the role of the government in that digital environment? We know what the authorities are of the Austin Police Department and others, the Coast Guard or TSA officials, but in that digital environment, which is owned and operated 85% by the private sector, what is the appropriate role of government? And how is the government and private sector and others going to be able to work together to try to better secure and make that environment much more resilient in the event of attacks? I've called for many years to a deafness, I think, in Congress of having an independent commission that's going to be set up to deal with the cyber environment. Just like after 9/11, there was an independent commission that really did address a number of the shortcomings in government, and a number of changes were made. So it's a very complex environment. It has so much there that I think we as a society really need to be able to address.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd offer is that when we look at cyber, I think we have to come to an agreement that we are engaged in conflict. And from a military standpoint, when you think of conflict, you think of rules of engagement. You think of the law of armed conflict, things that we can do, things that we should do in the event of an attack. So I don't know that we as a nation have gotten our head around the fact that when somebody is interfering with our elections, that is an attack. Now, whether you think it's an attack like 9/11, it's irrespective of that. It is an attack. So what is our strategy for dealing with that? And again, back to the earlier point, we can't wait until it happens and then have this conversation about it. We need to decide right now that when a country attacks us with their cyber tools, we have a set of responses. Now, I know the cyber guys in their mind have this idea of what they're going to do, but we as a nation haven't come to grips with exactly what that looks like. If somebody were to put a surface-to-surface missile against an aircraft carrier, we know exactly what we would do. If somebody were to kill an ambassador overseas, we know exactly what we would do. We need to define exactly what we are going to do when these nation-state actors attack us with cyber tools.
Darla, next question.
Thank you. Next, Anthony Orano asks, do you think it's possible Russia changed votes in the 2016 election?
Everyone heard the question, is it possible Russia changed votes in the 2016 election? All right, who wants to take that softball? Okay. All right, Richard.
Yes. The question is how, and did they change them in the voting machines, or did they change them in people's minds? We know they changed people's minds. We know there was a massive influence operation. We've been reporting on it extensively. I've got another hour special on Sunday just focusing on this. We keep reporting on it, and every day there is more and more reporting about it, and more people connecting the dots about how massive this Russian campaign, many have described it as the most successful influence operation carried out by any intelligence agency in modern history, if not ever. So yes, they certainly changed votes. Did they change enough votes to sway the election? Did this campaign put Donald Trump in the White House? Some people say yes, other people say if Hillary Clinton had gone to the Midwest, that we wouldn't be in this situation. So it's hard to know how many votes, but to answer the question at its face value, did this campaign change votes? Absolutely.
The only thing I'd add to that is I think whether it's 10 votes or 10 million votes, I think is almost immaterial. If you're talking about it in the way that Bill is, and needing to think through how we would respond using the tools at our disposal in terms of national security, it shouldn't matter whether the outcome was affected. It was the fact that a nation-state actor thought that it had the wherewithal and could do so at acceptable cost, could intervene in our political system. Whether they did so to change 10 votes or 10 million, to me, actually doesn't matter.
What they said.
Yeah.
Darla, let's try to get in one more question here. We're
Okay.
coming up on the end.
Both John Brennan and Nicholas Rasmussen said we have the military capacity, and now we need to address the other factors that lead to terrorism. What are those other factors, and how do we address them?
So the root causes of terrorism, battle of ideas. Who wants to take this up?
Well, I think as was mentioned earlier, the United States for many, many years and decades was a voice of reason in terms of making sure that individuals were not able to trample upon human rights and dignities with impunity and hold some of these authoritarian leaders to account because they're suppressing political expression, they're oppressing their peoples. That, I think, just leads to this incubation of extremism, violence, and terrorism. But there are a whole host of issues that run the gamut from political development, economic development, humanitarian, other issues. And so there's no silver bullet. I don't want to give the impression that it's very easy to take care of those conditions and circumstances. But I do think we have to be thinking about it in a longer term and not just the ability to kick down doors or to take out terrorist leaders or even operatives. It is what can you do in the villages of Pakistan or Egypt or whatever so that you don't have those forces of extremism that are gaining traction and root and attracting more adherents. So it's getting them more diplomats involved and having that dialogue with the foreign countries. I think all of this is part of what the United States has represented for so many years, and I sure as hell hope it's going to do that in the future too.
I have I don't know, maybe it's optimism, but I think it's education. I think the root cause of so much of the problem is ignorance, is anger, that when people don't know enough, they're easily manipulated, they're easily enraged, and I think you see this across the board in societies. So I think empowerment of education, of women's education, more access to literacy, more access to education opportunities. I think that's really over time what will help. Is it an answer to terrorism? No, they're going to be angry people who want to use the tools available to them to try to hurt a more powerful enemy. But I think over time, the more girls in school, the more people in school, the better we are.
All right.
One of the things I asked the analysts who work for me at the National Counterterrorism Center to do in my last year of government was to convene a conference, and the theme of the conference was, how does it all end? How does this post-9/11 period that Richard talked about earlier, when do we put brackets around it? When do we say this is over and we move on to some other set of national security threats? Their answer after a couple of days of talking to people both inside and outside of government was, it doesn't end. But that's a note of pessimism, but on a note of optimism, we have within our capacity the ability to shrink the size of the problem using the kinds of tools that John described and Richard described, where the problem set can be much more manageable and can be put in perspective. It doesn't have to have an outsized influence on the way we live or the way we think. And that should be the objective. That's not winning the GWAT, to use Richard's phraseology, the global war on terror, but it's putting terrorism in a place where it's not everybody's everyday concern, which it shouldn't be.
All right, Admiral, let's give you the last word.
Yeah, I'll just kind of dovetail off something Richard said. You know, I'm often asked in settings like this, if we're talking about national security, what do I consider the number one national security threat? And you've heard me say this before, Will, but I think the number one national security threat to the United States is K through 12 education. And because if we are not educating the youth of America in a way that expands their understanding of the world around them, that allows them to think critically, that exposes them to new ideas, then we won't have to worry about our national security in 20 or 30 years because it will be tough to have a nation that is the kind of bright, shining light we hope it will be. But to Richard's point, I think it is exactly the same around the world. It is about, if I had to look at one silver bullet for the solution piece, it would be education. We know it's not poverty as the single one because you look at Haiti. I mean, Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It's not a hotbed of terrorism. And then the 9/11 bombers came from fairly sophisticated, well-off families. So there really isn't, I think, one kind of root cause. There are a lot of things out there. But if I had to invest in one area in order to change the fabric of the international community, it would be in education, not only for our friends and allies, but frankly here at home.
Thank you. Folks, I would love to stay here all day and keep this going with these guys, but our time is up. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.